Hey everyone, it's Jaime Alejandro, and this is the Arts Calling podcast, where I have informal conversations with independent creatives from all walks of life in the literary, visual, and performing arts. We have a tremendous conversation lined up for you today, but before I get to it, I just want to share two things very quickly. Number one, the email is ready to go. That is artscallingpodcast@gmail.com. If you want to share some thoughts about the episodes that you're listening to, if you have any thoughts or grievances about the way that I'm asking questions, I'd love to hear it. Love to hear your thoughts. Maybe we can connect that way. Your feedback is always welcome. And number two, I want to take this intro space to do a couple of shout outs and share some updates about friends of the show, people who are doing phenomenal work, whether it's podcasting or they're releasing a new project and we don't get the chance to talk. This is where our shout outs are going to take place. This week, I'm excited to tell you about Switchyard. Award-winning editor, journalist, and author Ted Genoways hosts Switchyard, a literary magazine podcast featuring eye-opening essays, moving fiction, soul-stirring poetry, and honest, thought-provoking conversation. Guests include graphic novelist Art Spiegelman, poet Natasha Trethewey, Maya Kobabe, and more. You can find Switchyard on all major podcast platforms. This is a literary podcast you definitely want to add to your rotation. Now this week, I'm very excited to be Arts Calling Elizabeth M. Castillo. About Elizabeth, she is a British Mauritian poet, writer, and indie press promoter, and a two-time Pushcart Prize nominee. She lives in Paris with her family and two cats, where she writes different things in different languages under different pen names. Her writing has been published internationally, and her bilingual debut, Cajoncito, is on sale now. Her chapbook, Not Quite an Ocean, is available now from 9 Pence Press. With that said, let's give her a call. Hello, is anybody there?
Hi.
Hello. Well, Elizabeth, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I'm very thrilled to get to chat with you. A world poet in many ways, but that seems a bit reductive too, because there's just so many angles that you take with your work and the way that you go about your life. So, how is it going over there in your neck of the woods?
Thank you, Jaime. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm in Paris, very hot, sweltering. Let's drag on the floor and pretend to be slugs, Paris. But no, things are going good. My book has been out, my latest pamphlet, Not Quite an Ocean, for just over a month. No, 2 months now. Gosh. And I've been promoting it like crazy. So at the moment, I'm in that kind of dip that we have as indie creatives where we go, and then we need to recover a little bit, I think, from all our efforts.
Yeah, I was going to ask you how the marketing circuit has been, how the promotion has been of the book.
It's been a very enjoyable process, as you know, so no one is confused. As an indie writer, it's pretty much yourself doing it all. There's no publicist, there's none of these things. But thankfully, the indie writing community, particularly the poetry community and the, I'd say, short fiction sort of community, are so supportive. I think we're really tired of things being gate kept in literature. So everyone is very open to help, to let you have a favor, to boost you on social media, to put you on a podcast. So it's been a lot of hard work. I knew it would be, but I was happy to do it. And I definitely have learned a lot in the process. There's definitely ways of getting our indie books out there that are successful. But I think that perhaps there's not too many resources out there to help us do it. So I will actually be working, if I can just plug that, I will actually be working on some workshops on how to promote indie work probably next year. How to promote your books, your podcast, whatever it is you have going on in a way that is sustainable for us indie artists, because we need to help each other. I mean, we are a community, you know what I mean? What we put out there is what we're going to give back. So that's really what I found. A lot of the people who actually helped me promote the book were people that I've promoted in sometimes tiny way in the past, just by, posting a picture of their book and saying, oh, I love this, or leaving them a great review or whatever. And in turn, when I came back saying, do you mind terribly featuring this on your, next blog post or something? They were like, yeah, of course. So that's what's really magical about this community, I think. I don't think that it exists. I also write novels and I write children's literature under different pen names. And I must say that neither of those communities are anywhere half as nice as my poetry people, I must say. They are just, it's such a lovely, you know what I mean? Family community.
Yeah.
It's a real community-minded community.
Yeah, and I've really been taken with Twitter of all places, and I've said this countless times on the podcast. The reason this podcast exists is because of Twitter, and for whatever reason, there's
Mm,
just this magical convergence there, especially when it comes to poets and writers. And you kind of
there
get me
is.
thinking in various directions about the things that you've done,
Mm,
and I'm really glad that you're talking about sharing some of that knowledge about marketing and really the most difficult part of
yeah.
this creative process. But if we could backtrack for just a moment, because that set the stage
Yes,
just
yes.
well, I'm very curious about Mauritius and your life
Hmm.
in the early beginning, because you have such a fascinating origin that it would be nice
Hmm.
to kind of recollect some of those things. Can you remember and maybe share a few thoughts about Mauritius, which seems to be the beginning, right, for you?
Not really. Not really. Before Mauritius was the Congo. I was actually born there in Zaire. There's not that many memories of that. But yeah, I was born in, well, in London, but my parents were living in the Congo. So at a month old, I was back in Zaire. And then I was in London for a bit. And then my formative years have been spent in Mauritius. But my parents have always been travelers. My family moved around, my father for business, but both my parents were Mauritian, but immigrants to English speaking countries. My father grew up in South Africa and my mother in London. So, already as Mauritians, we weren't particularly Mauritian in that French or
Mm.
Creole wasn't our first language. And both my parents sort of raised us with a very much a citizen of the world kind of upbringing. And I suppose that's always been a cornerstone of my identity, even though it's not much of a cornerstone, because when it comes down to it, when you fit in everywhere and nowhere, it's a kind of tricky act to live through throughout your life, especially when you go on to choose a career, choose a partner, raise your children. All of these questions of who you are and what your identity is comes into play. But Mauritius itself is where I spent my formative years, very
Mm.
small tropical island, Paradise Island, number one tourist destination in the world for many, many years.
Mm.
Beautiful place. I mean, definitely, if you get a chance, go and see it. Um, so, a very interesting place because it's a place that had no native population. So, everybody on that island is there purely because of colonial caprice, are
Oh,
there
wow.
because they were either settlers, Europeans, slaves, indentured laborers, and it's fascinating because all of the places that I've been to in the Americas, where there are a lot of similarities, obviously the suffering of the colony is there's a lot of similar symptoms all over the globe. But the lack of having a native population is a very interesting one because it literally means that it is a nation of people who have absolutely no roots, the vast majority of them. Which is very, I think, which has an impact on how they see themselves, how the colony becomes so central to their identity for the little good and for worse. For example, someone who will only speak Creole, the complexes that that will give them, their internalized racism against themselves and people like themselves. And that's actually a subject that I explore a lot. My parents, even though they were educated people, never taught me Creole because to this day they're like, well, why? What purpose would it have served you, Lizzie, in your life? And to a greater extent, my grandmother, when I would speak even a word of Creole at the table, she'd chuck a fork down the table at me because we didn't speak that slave vulgar language in the house. Um, so it's a very interesting background to have as myself. And I read, maybe that's why I also relate to a lot of, because there's a very, very strong voices coming out of Mexican writers in America who have that feeling of, yes, we're Mexican, yes, we speak Spanish, but we're not Mexican enough. When we go visit
Yeah.
our maybe extended family back in Mexico, or we
Right.
feel feel so white, we feel like gringos or whatever. And I relate to that because it's like, yeah, you're super Mauritian when you're not in Mauritius, but when you're in Mauritius, you're not Mauritian enough. And in fact, this wonderful Nigerian writer wrote a very short poem called Diaspora Blues, where she said, and it's the same thing of Nigerian, there's a big Nigerian diaspora in the UK, obviously, where she said, so here you are, something, something. too foreign for here, too foreign for home. And that's exactly it. That represents everything.
That is such a heartbreaking. It is a personal tragedy that goes about, from here to there. And the way you were describing a lot of Mexican poets or poets who were a little bit Mexican, a little bit from somewhere else, really articulates that very well too for me, because I'm pretty white, I guess, by some Mexican standards, but also really,
Yes,
really brown by Wyoming standards, which is
American.
like the cowboy state over here.
Yeah.
But this kind of leads me to think about something in that your relationship to cultures almost uncouples you from that, and then perhaps allows the idea of nature and the world itself to become a greater home. Do you feel like there was some kind of realization, when you were that young about finding a greater home in the world through the work that you're doing? Because there's a lot of subject matter in your work that is more
Mm,
about, in particular, the ocean, which is, you do a
mm,
phenomenal job, with that particular
thank
subject.
you.
But do you feel like the roots of finding nature as your home, did you feel that
Hmm.
that was an early impulse, or was that something that was more
No,
intellectual later on and then you found through
it
writing?
was, it wasn't any of those things, but that's an excellent question. It was not an early impulse because I think the earliest impulse was confusion. I remember my mother, and then I found out because my mother we're quite fair skinned, even though we're mixed race, just, that happens in families. There's always one who's really pale and one who's really dark. And so my mother in the 70s in London was picked on and bullied for being, they use a horrible slur, but Indian Pakistani, even though she wasn't, she was Mauritian. And so she grew up with this huge fear of anyone labeling her children anything. And so she never, in a desire to protect us, told us that we were mixed race. And so we grew up, and it's only when we came to Mauritius, a very small island, small mind mentality, where people were like, what are you?
Yeah,
White,
yeah.
black, And I remember coming home, and in fact, I've written a piece of short fiction about it, coming home and being like, Mommy, what am I? And as much as she can say it's not what matters, the inside, not the outside, whatever. When you're faced with the reality of it and you're looking at the world around you, you're still like, something I'm not being told. So if anything, as a child, it was confusion. But how it came about for me wasn't even an intellectual thing. It was, I suppose, going out into the world as an adult, going to work, going to travel in Latin America. I've embraced Spanish as Spanish is the love of my life as a language, and I love Latin America, possibly because also I feel very at home there because of that kind of mixed um, history of we are but we're not in many places, and so it was sort of going through those places and being so far removed from everything I knew, and that being okay because what I knew wasn't necessarily didn't have a firm grasp on me, but it was especially galvanized, I think, when I became a mother, because
Mm,
then I think possibly intellectually, but very much biologically, you think about what heritage you're giving your children. And I don't mean ethnic heritage. I mean, what culture, what are you teaching them? What food are you serving them? What manners in my household, my husband is French, and we have this big thing about how in English speaking countries, you keep the hand you're not using under the table. But in French speaking countries, your hand should be visible at all times. So it's that kind of thing. What are you teaching your kids?
yeah.
The minutiae of every day. So that's when I think it wasn't even a question. It was almost this feral cry of, who am I? And what have I got to show for it in this world? And what am I giving to these? I have two girls. What am I giving to these two girls? And I think I should add it was made, perhaps it was emphasized being in France where there is such a strong identity. The French are very French. My husband is very French. That we eat this way and we dress this way and this. Yes, the world loves them because they're chic, but they're chic because it's like the law here. You know what I mean? There's
You
so
don't have a
faced with so much.
choice.
No, you don't. How dare you mix colors? I mean, really, how dare you not wear a coat that is beige, kind of thing. But because faced with that rigidity, you're just like, I really don't fit in here. So
Mm,
who am I? And who do I want to be? And who am I to these children? And what is my mark on the world? And where is exactly as you said, where is my home? And where is my place in the world? So more than an intellectual question, it was sort of a feral cry from the deep poetic depth of my soul that I guess I answered in part in this book, but I keep, it's definitely something that I keep mining for who knows how long. to be honest.
Yeah, it seems like it's going to be fertile ground for a lot of years to come. For many of us,
Yeah.
and I include myself in that because it's such a fascinating topic to uncover. But I love the
Mm,
description that you use in terms of this awakening, this feral cry, especially when it comes to motherhood. And I imagine the
mm,
kind of
mhm.
as I said, awakening to a larger purpose, sort of a bigger perspective. And I wonder, because I remember you mentioning in some podcasts that you did that you took a break from writing, that you weren't really, that you had to step away, or maybe that wasn't something that you were into. So I'm curious if that aligned with you becoming a parent, or when did poetry make its way into your life? Because it seemed that you had a break, a long one.
Yes, I did. So I wrote, I mean, like every angsty, heartbroken teen, I wrote a lot of angsty, terrible poetry. And then I wrote poetry from traveling, and I just sort of, yeah, journaled my way in a poetic way, but it was never anything more than that. And I started a few novels and whatever, and then it definitely, I think poetry took on and what would I guess I started, no, not poetry. Poetry was always there. I guess I started to take poetry seriously when I fell into a depression, basically. I think I got to the point of myself where I needed I it was something that was just pouring out of me, because I think there is, I mean, I'm a woman of color. You can imagine there's lots of trauma in my life,
Yeah.
just by, just because of that alone. And so there's a lot of build up, and I had difficult pregnancies as well, and difficult, so there was lots of things there, and poetry just kind of poured out of me. And I decided to take it seriously, and to write it seriously, and to craft it into something, and learn more about it, and not just sort of vomit out onto a page for myself, but really honor the art form and honor the process of it. And so that's sort of how that came about. But as many things in my life, I think everything is kind of just snowballed from birth, kind of thing. You know what I mean? Things just happen. And that's the beauty of life, isn't it? Things happen and lead on to other things and inspire. And even the bad things, they inspire other things, and you recover, and they are turned into beautiful other seeds that grow into beautiful plants. So there's just a constant things. It's like that term in physics. Energy is neither created nor destroyed, but constantly turned from one. It's exactly like that I find, and so that's definitely what poetry in my writing is for me today. It's turning and transforming all of these things into something creative, artistic, and valuable in the world.
Yeah. Oh, I love that you mentioned that, because it reminds me of my favorite songwriter, Jorge Drexler. He's South American, and
Yes, 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 of
he
course.
writes, "Nothing is lost; everything transforms." But
Exactly.
I wonder about your time in Latin America, and you studied that too, right? That was the reason you went down there, wasn't it? You
Yes,
studied
I was.
Latin.
I was. I
Yeah.
was. I was studying history and politics of Latin America,
Okay.
and so I
So
went to work for a year in Chile and Mexico.
if we could elaborate a little bit more on those kinds of discoveries, because it seemed like it opened up your world. Can we talk about perhaps literature for a moment, or maybe some inspirations that you may have picked up along the way while you were down there
Mhm.
that have impacted you?
Well, those were funny because they actually kind of surfaced years and years later. I didn't
Mm,
realize how much things had impacted me. My first collection, Cajoncito, Chile is all through those pages. There's the Andes, there's the Pacific, there's the Atacama, there's like 7 poems about the Raito del Sol, which is a tiny flower that only flowers for 10 days in the Atacama Desert. And so that all kind of just poured out by itself in a very natural way. But there is something about particularly the history of Chile being such a removed country from the rest of Latin America. And one of the funniest things I remember when I was teaching English when I was there, as well as doing some research. And I came in, and I was said something to my students about something, and the first thing they all said to me was, "We don't dance." I was like, "What?" But the way they looked at me, it wasn't even like, "No, we're not that kind of Latin American." They were like, "Don't you dare even, don't just put an end to
the
that in your
line is
mind right now,
drawn.
lady. We don't dance." But it's true, they're so different from it, whether it's culturally and things like that,
Hmm.
to linguistically. Chilean Spanish is the most complicated Spanish in the world to understand. um, to even geographically and geologically, like the the country itself is so apart from even Argentina and Bolivia, which are its borders. And that's because of, first of all, they've got the Atacama in the north, which is the driest place on earth, and the the Andes. So it's geographically cut off. And if you look at the history, obviously this is not a history podcast, but if you look at the history, even if you look at how the invasion of Latin America happened and all the Spanish came down, et cetera, they couldn't actually get to most of Chile for the longest time. And then the Mapuche, who were the indigenous people, fought them off really successfully for the longest time as well. So it is such an unusual, in that Latin American bloc, that Spanish-speaking bloc of countries where there's so many similarities, it is such an unusual place. And it's also a place that is constantly ravaged by, deadly earthquakes, that has had a tsunami, that has had riots, has had political coups that they're still recovering from, that has had the hands of been passed through hands of government right and left, that has had, I was there during the Students' Revolution. It's just a country that has suffered, has bled and has clawed its way back repeatedly. And that shows in the people and in the culture. And that is something I think that struck me when I was there and that I carry with me to this day. They are such a soldiering people. And they are such a determined people to make the best of what they have and to be proud of their country and their nation and their battles and the way they used to run from the tear gas in the streets and the way, they rebuilt their house after it collapsed for the sixth time. There is such a healthy pride in Chile that I think really informed a lot of my writing. And I think I write it a lot in the form, I'm obviously a poet, so there's lots of metaphors, in the form of the mountains, the Andes that stand erect and that, will bow to no one. And then the Atacama that does not apologize for being the driest place on earth. And too bad for you if you can't cross me, kind of thing, So there's definitely that, it has that symbol and that place in my artistic heart and mind that even in this book, Not Quite an Ocean, even though it's less overt, I did sort of wander back to that corner of the world as well to get some of my metaphors and my images from there as well.
Oh, that's beautiful. What a strong, resilient people. And it's kind
resilient.
Of yeah. Before we talk about Not Quite an Ocean, which is a delightful title, and I know there's a beautiful story behind that one, I'd like to talk about Cajoncito, which is an equally beautiful title. I love that word. It's so full of something, even though it's so diminutive and lovely.
Yes.
That was your first collection, right?
Absolutely.
I'd like to sort of get a sense of how that one came to be, because it seems like once you get through the first one, then everything started pouring out, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Could you share a bit about that?
Yes, so Cajoncito was an interesting project because it was originally I had, as I said, I sort of came off that cusp of very shaky mental health and just, lots of low feelings, let's be honest. And it was coming out of a place which, and I mean, I make no secrets about the inspiration for my work, in that I came from a place where COVID had started. I had suffered a miscarriage. About 5 people in my family had died in the space of 6 months.
Oh,
there was a lot of grief.
Mm-hmm.
I lost a very good friend through very horrible circumstances. Lots of things happened all in a small amount of time. And Cajoncito was basically my processing of that. Originally, I spat out these poems and I thought to myself, you know what, I'm going to put them in a little book and I'm going to bind it myself. I'm going to be like, this is my little Cajoncito. Because the idea was something that I said to a friend at the time. It's like, Cajoncito, for those who don't know, means little box or little drawer. Cajon, cajoncito, ito being the diminutive, as you said. So the idea was it was a box for all of these events and all of this grief that has a place in the world that needs to come out, but now it's in its box and we put it away. So that was kind of how I saw it. But then when I began to share my poems and send them out to magazines and I'd see a magazine with a sub-call about, I don't know, mountains, and I had 3 poems about the Andes or whatever. I'd be like, hey, why not? And people started to respond in the amazing way that people do to poetry, in that I had written something about, the loss of a friend, and they'd been like, oh, my dog died, and it, that could relate to it, which is wonderful because that's what poetry is. It is what the reader needs, So as that happened, I was like, well, maybe I should actually do something with this. And then an astonishing thing happened is that I started to write in Spanish, which is my fourth language. So the poems just started to come out, and I was having so much fun with it because, as I say, Spanish is the love of my life. I love the sound of it. I love the rawness of it. I love the energy, the bounce. I love Chilean Spanish. There's so much I love about the language. And so the poems just started coming out in Spanish. And after a while, I had the same amount of Spanish poems and English poems. And I was thinking, but how's this going to work? What do we do here? Kind of thing. And I met a very talented poet and translator, Andres Piña, who's a very good friend of mine. And we ended up translating the whole thing together. So he did from English to Spanish. I did mine from Spanish to English, which is a very interesting exercise, although I would not recommend it because it's hard to translate your own poetry because you know the intention and you're too close to it to be able to actually do it literary justice. So I think we managed, but I wouldn't do it again. And then Castillo was born. It was this 60-page book of English, Spanish, and bits of French, bits of Creole, bits of Portuguese poetry. It's called Castillo Poems on Love, Loss y Otras Locuras. And I call it my little achy breaky poetry, but because it is, not in the sense of someone left a review who was like, yes, it's a book all about sort of, breaking up with a boyfriend or a husband or a relationship like that. And it's not. There's literally 7,000 different types of grief in it and 7,000 different types of love and celebration, and there's friendships, there's mother figures, there's father figures, there's whole countries, there's lots in there. And so that's kind of how it came about. I'm still extraordinarily proud of it, Again, it was self-published because I really wanted creative control. It was accepted by 2 publishers, but they didn't want so much Spanish. They were like, no, let's keep it for an English audience, which I thought was incredibly unfair.
Yeah.
So I thought, no, I'm going to keep it as it is. There comes a point, I think, as an artist where you have to be true to the art. And there we go. That's how it came into the world.
That's phenomenal. And I'd like to pry a little bit about the translation aspect because it's so fascinating to me. Was there a moment in the collection where there was a piece or a poem in particular that you can remember that gave you trouble, that you felt like it wasn't really conveying anything? Because as you said, it's one thing to have intent, but then you allow the other individual to come in and sometimes maybe imbue something else or sometimes try to be impartial as possible. Was there something that gave you trouble in that collection as you translated?
There were a few times from the English into the Spanish, because again, it's my fourth language. So that's where a relationship of trust is so important with the translator. And Andres, I trust him with my eyes closed. He's so amazing. And often he'd be like, well, I could say this in Spanish, but it just doesn't sound very good. So I'm going to say this instead. And I think there was only once that I was like, no, I'm keeping the thing that doesn't sound very good. But then afterwards I went back to him like, no, I think you were right. But that was the odd sentence or the odd expression. Like, for example, in one of the poems and it's very niche stuff. Like one of them is gorse and spider silk. Okay, gorse being a material I had to look up because I needed a 1-syllable material. So I wasn't even that attached to it. And he was like, I don't know what gorse is, but I'm putting silk and something else. I'm like, yeah, that's fine. So it was often very niche things like that, that don't really have that much importance. But it was harder for me because I obviously know what I wrote the first poem about, the original poem. And then I'm doing it into English now. And I really had to translate it, leave it for a good 4 or 5 days, come back to it, work on it again, because otherwise you're literally writing a completely different poem because you want to get, as you said, the intention, but the poem is not the same. The metaphor's gone, the balance is gone, the rhythm is gone. It's not the same poem at all anymore. So it was a very, very laborious and very tricky process, I must say. Interesting one, but as I said, I would not do it again. It wasn't fun enough to do it again.
Yeah, because it seems like you just have to turn your work uncanny in some way by some kind of tactic,
Exactly.
like get away from it or don't look at it.
Exactly.
But I can imagine it being just a pretty intense exercise, but definitely one worth doing, it sounds like.
Absolutely. Everyone should do it once in their life, once and then not again.
So let's talk about Not Quite an Ocean, which, again, a phenomenal collection. I've read a little
Thank
bit of
you.
it as you've shared some on the podcast because I'm nosy and I'm just trying to get as many podcasts in as possible before I get to talk to you. And I think that you've done a remarkable job, from what I gather, about really articulating that metaphor so well of the ocean and blending it in with motherhood and embracing that. Could you share a bit about that particular collection, its genesis, and maybe how you feel about it now?
Okay, sure, of course. So that collection, it's a very unusual how it came about. I've mentioned this before in that I had Castillo and then I had two other projects that were around a theme. So it's very specifically, one of them's about motherhood and one of them's about Mauritius, colonial Mauritius, basically. And then I had a whole bunch of poems that were kind of out in the wild, that I'd written about. One of them was like an Angela Carter magical realism-esque thing, which is my favorite poem ever written, by the way. Another one was about this vengeful storm off the coast of Chile. Like there was some really random, very valuable poems, but not that didn't fit anywhere. And I had the really good luck of the being contacted by the editor of Ninepence Press, who heard that I was working on more work after Cajoncito, and said, "I want to publish your next book," basically. Mm-hmm. And I mean, that doesn't come along often I think in publishing. So I was like, well, I can't let that slide, can I? But my motherhood collection was more than a pamphlet, and I felt like it wasn't ready. Mauritian collection was too experimental. So I was like, well, what am I going to do? I need to publish something, and not just anything. So I kind of gathered all those poems together and stared at them blankly for a while. And then as I went back, and I think other poets do this too, where I often note down like a title or a line or two lines or an image in my phone. And I went through a point where I think I was just very tired or burnt out, and I didn't want to create anything new. So I just went through my poem stubs. And I was like, ooh, let's make this into something, and make that into something. And from there, actually made a whole bunch of fairly decent poems, added those to the pile. And as I was looking at it, I saw womanhood, the ocean, rage, feminine rage, or woman and feminine rage go together, and the environment. The motherhood is a funny thing because many people see motherhood in this poetry collection. Perhaps it is because I'm literally working on another collection about motherhood that I'm like, there's not that much of it in this. If you think this is motherhood, wait until you see the next one, kind of thing.
Yeah. And I think a lot of it might have been influenced. I guess my response about motherhood might have been about the podcast, because you kind of mention a lot of those things because it's such a huge part of your life that I thought, well, maybe that could be a huge aspect of it.
No, it must be in there because I mean, it's been mentioned by a few people. I'm not, and it's not an issue that is, but it's interesting because it wasn't necessarily what I saw,
Right.
And so from there, I just kind of organized the poems as best I could and played around with them until they seemed to be happy with their, playmates. And there we go. And that's where the collection came from, really. Mm-hmm. And because it came about in such an unusual way, I was very afraid that it would kind of be like, here's a whole bunch of poems that don't have a home. There you go. Yeah. But I'm actually extremely proud of it. And I've read it now, months after sending out the manuscript to obviously the editor, last year, read it again as a whole collection. And I'm very proud of it. Objectively, I think it's a good pamphlet, and it's the kind of pamphlet I would enjoy reading. So I think that's saying something when you can remove yourself so far from the poetry that you actually think, oh, I'm enjoying this. This is actually quite good. Then that's very satisfying as a writer because it no longer holds the personal value to you. It just holds literary value. I'm very, very proud of it.
Yeah, for sure. That is the goal, right? That is the ideal, where you get to the point where maybe a couple of years down the road, you don't recognize yourself in it because it's so much of its own thing. It has its own journey. And that leads me to ask you, I want to ask you about motherhood, and I want to ask you about, I don't know if you use Google Keep, but just notes, right? You use those a lot in your process. But my main concern here, or not concern, but thing that I want to ask you is about creative fortitude and finding the strength to go beyond. And I think you've mentioned it. A lot of us who have kids who have other things going on in life, there's so many things at our heels to get our attention. And you have managed to write consistently. You have two kids. I only have the one, and I don't know what to do sometimes, but to have that kind of momentum built in do you feel that it is that kind of cry that is still lingering from when you first started going in this direction, or how do you maintain?
That is such a good question. And in fact, it's something that I'm also going to be doing workshops on goal setting and sustainable creative practice. Because I also, like a lot of us creatives, I have ADHD and I'm severely dyslexic. So there's also the element of, ooh, a project, ooh, another project. So
Yeah.
so there's also that. Let's not lie. I have two kids. I homeschool my kids too, so they're always with me.
Mhm.
Um, but I definitely, there is a need in me, just like, and when I explain it, for example, my husband's not very literary, but I explain it to me, it's very athletic. I say, it's like you need to exercise, you need to go out and have a run. I need to be creative. It makes me a better mother. It makes me a better person. It makes me a better wife. It makes me a better just to be around because it is part of me that needs to express itself. Now, I also hold very closely to Joni Mitchell's concept of crop rotation because I think, like most people like me with ADHD, I'm creative in different areas. I write poetry, I write short fiction, I have my workshops, I'm a teacher. I also write novels, kid lit. I also do craft. Like there's lots of little things. So there comes a point where for example, right now, I've published this book, I've promoted it quite aggressively, is the only way to express it. And I'm a little bit, right now the poems aren't flowing out of me. Let's be honest, they're not. I wrote a few recently in Mauritius, but I'm not on a roll to resubmit and get into that straight away. However, I am working on my novel, Like There's No Tomorrow, because for some reason that has suddenly, started pouring out of me. So I'm leaning into that all the way. So we kind of crop rotate. It's the same way. You plant your field of carrots and you let it grow and you tend to your barley and you let that grow and then you tend to your watercress. And that is exactly how I see it. And for me, that is the most sustainable practice. And one thing I've seen with my children, as not just a mother, but a homeschool mom, so I repeat, they're always with me, these kids. I'm never alone. Is that it's good for them to see, especially because I have girls and I'm a woman, that they see that my pursuits are worth pursuing and that they see right now, mummy's writing. Mummy's writing, and it's important to her so that when they then go on to dance, to be engineers, to start writing comics, whatever it is that they feel the legitimacy of pursuing that and that it is important for them and that not everything has to be in pursuit of capitalism, in pursuit of being paid, or in pursuit of, whatever it is. I mean, if we're paid, let's be honest now. No one's saying no to that, but that their pursuits and their passions are legitimate and are part of who they are, and are just as worthy as whatever other pursuit could be seen by anyone else or anyone else's opinion on any other pursuit. And it's a tricky thing, I think, especially as a mother, because there's so much guilt and there's so much expectation. You need to work like you don't have kids and parent like you don't have work and this and that and the other. And there comes a point where you're like, no, I just need to love my children and do my best. And that's what that's my message to them. I'm doing my best for you. I'm spending the time that you need, with you. I'm loving you. I'm there for you, but I'm also there for me. And I'm there for my husband, and I'm there for my cat, and I'm there for my church community, and I'm there for my parents. You know what I mean? I'm there for those who need me because we are multifaceted creatures. But this part of me, I'm also there for that. The creative part of my person, I'm also showing up for her. And that's really essential. Building on from that, there are also, I think, practical steps, especially as parents, maybe that I will put together, as I mentioned, into workshops for the future, because I really think it is helpful for people. And we can get very burnt out with what burns us out is not the creativity. I don't think creativity is ever draining. It is everything around it. It's finding the time to write. It's balancing that with other things. It's promoting yourself. Or social media, making sure that you have a presence, your author branding, all of this stuff is so exhausting. But the actual creation, Jaime,
it's liberation.
It's liberating. It's energizing. You know what I mean? Nothing is more energizing than it's like energy. It transforms into more energy. So I think there are also practical ways in which we can make our lives a bit easier, which I will be looking at. Obviously, I'll let you know, obviously, on email, on social media, when those things are launched. But I really think that it's something that creatives can benefit from. I know I would have benefited from being told that, when I started out, kind of thing. I feel like I've rambled away from your question, have I?
No, this is lovely because I love, passing the floor to you, because I think that there's so much that you're passionate about. And in particular, the modeling aspect, it might be the biggest lesson for any parent creative. I come from a family of musicians and hardworking
Oh,
women,
wonderful.
raised by a lot of women. But I noticed something that you touched on that is so powerful, which is women, some women, and I'm just speaking from my personal experience of some of the women that I've known who've raised me, who I love dearly,
Mm,
felt
mm,
like they needed to set aside their life and their joy and their
mm,
purpose
mm.
in service of everyone else in the family.
Yeah.
And what an empowering thing to say. And empowering is such a tired word that I'm trying not to
No,
use,
but I know what you
but
mean.
it is that feeling that, look, this woman has an aspect of nourishment that belongs to her
Mm,
and her alone, and I think
mm.
that it is a lesson for everyone, and it extends
Yeah.
to all kinds of people. But I just want to applaud you for that and thank you for
Thank you.
that honesty, because it is one of the greatest lessons that we could ever pass on. We can't stop, and even if we could, we would be miserable. And from personal experience.
Exactly. I think
Yeah.
that's the proof of it. Yeah, that's the proof of it, is that when you stop, you are miserable. And I think that something has been given to each one of us in this world. Some of us are artists, some of us are athletes, some of us are problem solvers, some of us are with so many of us. And I think that that is not by mistake, and that is something that we need to honor. And obviously, everyone's life is different, everyone's schedule is different, but if it has been put inside of you, then there is a way to make it work. And I am convinced of that. Maybe we won't get the way perfectly straight away. There will be bumps and tumbles and scraped knees as we learn how to manage our lives. But it is possible. Absolutely possible.
Yeah. Yeah. This is just wonderful. And I got a couple more questions to be mindful of your time, but I want to linger for just a little bit moment on this metaphor of the garden, right? You're tending your garden of creativity and you have your poetry, which is the carrot, and then maybe over here you go to
Yeah.
another vegetable, which might be the longer I guess
Hmm.
the long gestating works, like say a
Yeah.
novel or maybe fiction. What do you get out of those things that poetry doesn't provide, or what is it that shifts in you that allows you to go into the longer form, that is nourishing?
That is a fascinating question, Jaime. I have no idea. You flummoxed me. Okay, so I think part of it, I'm a quick thinker, you see. I think part of it is is that you is just burnout. It must be said, like, okay, I've been
Yeah,
promoting my poetry book that I love and that I'm proud of, but that's okay now. Now I
yeah,
kind of just
yeah,
need to do something else. It's like eating soup for a month. After a while, you want a steak,
yeah,
kind of
yeah.
thing. So I think that is a part of it. I'm not going to lie. And then I think also in my case, there comes a point where perhaps it's an ADHD related thing, but suddenly my focus and almost my mood shifts. The novel I'm writing at the moment is a Gothic retelling of an 18th century book. So Victorian England. It's Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South. So it's a retelling for now, but it might actually shift to a whole nother universe later. I don't know. But that's what I'm writing at the moment. And something in me, I think, after writing poetry and things that are very close to me and personal, I guess craves escape into a whole nother world. Because even though in my book, Not Quite an Ocean, there are poems which are narrative and, you're in a haunted forest or caught in the eye of a storm in South America, I still know what it's about. So it's never going to be fully, that escape for me. It's always going to be, I can always see myself in it, um, even though no one else might. Whereas in fiction, or at least my novel length fiction, there is that I am in that world, that universe. My sister is also a writer. In fact, she writes young adult. She's a very successful writer, and she more so lives in that world all the time. Since she was tiny, she's been telling herself stories, and she, a bit like Tolkien, she creates universes and disappears into them. And so every so often, kind of, I crave that, and so that's what I will do with my novels. And then for my children's books as well, I think more than anything, that will probably be inspired by something that's happening in my life, or I'll go and travel to a place and I'll be like, oh, I need to document the history of this into something that how would I present it to my children? I'm a teacher, an academic teacher by trade, so I always, I think, have that antenna on as well in terms of how, and a homeschooling mum now, so how would I break this down for a kid? How would I present it? So there's a lot of that, and then obviously the crafts that aren't writing related, my theater, my craft work, physical things, those are also often just because I crave doing something physical and I crave something that is mindless, that you're not really thinking too much. Um, So I'm not sure if that is at all a decent answer to your question, but that's the best I can think of.
Yeah, that is a perfect answer to the question. And I'm just going to pry for a moment. Tell me about theater for a little bit. As a theater person, I'm always intrigued. I'm always.
Okay, so so theater, it's nothing glamorous at the moment. I coach a local theater group for my church,
Oh,
basically.
that's awesome.
And but that's not an unfortunate one. Yes, unfortunately, in the sense that our program with coronavirus and with many things has been so packed that we haven't been able to do half, even a
Oh,
quarter of
that's a
what we
bummer.
wanted to do. But the skits and the sketches and the full length plays are being written in my head and are being mapped out and being discussed and hashed out all the time.
Oh, that's beautiful.
So there's a lot of that. And even just now, I mean, it's a ridiculous thing, but yeah, I think when you have a creative brain, you can't help it. My daughters are a bit obsessed with the Prince of Egypt at the moment, and so we're listening to the musical, And you must know how I am already like blocking the scene on the
Yeah,
stage and
yeah.
thinking, oh, we could do this really artistic, like abstract version of the Red Sea. And so I think that never really switches off. But I love the theater. I love musical theater. But as I said, I haven't. I know that a time will come in my life, whether it's sort of with the group that I'm coaching, or maybe with my own plays, or I don't know, but where I will definitely pursue that more actively, because it is something that I love and that I never studied. So I don't really know much about beyond my pleasure of, reading and keeping up with what's happening in the theater world. But no, definitely it's something that I love, and that one day in my life I do want to be more involved in.
So two more things from that question. Okay, so I
Yes,
I have to say your kids have good taste because The Prince of Egypt might be one of the best scores ever written.
it's
It's
amazing.
it's
It's so
gorgeous,
good.
lush, and incredible, and I cry sometimes, because it's
Oh, me
amazing.
too. Still.
Second, I was going to ask you about just this idea of what you're looking forward to in the future, because there's a lot that you kind of have going on, and I'm curious of what the next steps are for you outside of the novel. What is it that you're working on
Mhm,
right now for your craft
mhm,
that you
mhm.
think is a priority?
Well, there's a few things. I unfortunately I had to rush back home to Mauritius for a family emergency in
Mm,
August. So I had the Sealy challenge planned out, and I basically picked up two books. So I've got a nice pile that I need to work my way through, and I'm working my way through in a very mindful way. I'm actually like highlighting and illustrating and being like, because I want to improve my craft as much as possible. They can get to a point where, I've done a whole bunch of workshops and I've read about 700 books, and I've done online courses, but you can become very complacent, and I don't want to. I really want to push myself more, especially to experiment more, and yeah, to really, push my writing more in poetry and not be stagnant. I'm so sorry, forgive me, people are sending me messages. And so that's definitely something I will do on my own time. I'm focusing, writing wise, I'm definitely focusing on my novel, although every so often I'm sort of dabbling in a bit of short fiction. There's a big short fiction competition coming up, and I have promised myself I will have something ready for it. I'm actually writing in a genre that I very pretentiously am saying that I invented, but it's tropical gothic. Basically, it's
oh, that's
gothic things
amazing.
happening in a tropical setting, in Mauritius and places like that, with dilapidated houses and something that might be supernatural, but it's not actually. In the end, it's explained. You know what I mean? That sort of thing. And I'd like to submit some of that work, because those are the stories that are in my head, and I don't know why I haven't written them so far. So watch that space. And then the other thing I'm very excited about, but I think, need to recover a little bit artistically before I really put all of my heart and soul into them, are what I mentioned, the workshops and the classes on. I don't have an MFA. I know that's a big deal in America, or a degree in writing at all, in creative writing, but I have learned a lot. And so, although I'm not in a position to teach about, form or anything like that, I am in a position to teach about social media relations, about author branding, about sustainable goals, about avoiding burnout, promoting your book. So I'm looking to put together maybe some workshops that would be live, and even maybe some recorded videos that people could download, or guides, some sort of formats that could maybe guide people that they could buy or borrow. I'm not really sure. I'm working on the details at the moment, but definitely next year, that's something that I will be working on, offering to writers and creatives, not just poets. anybody who's sort of an indie creative of any sort who needs a little bit of help balancing their creative life and their goals with everything else they've got going on. So I'm pretty excited about that.
Yeah, and I'm really grateful for that, because one of the things that I wanted to ask you about as well was this drive to be true and not be held up by the conventions of, oh, you got to be a certified poet of arts or whatever. And
Yeah,
something that haunts me and that I try to rail against, because
of course.
you've done a phenomenal job of building something that is true to you, and you're not censoring yourself just because, of some degree or something like that. And so I really applaud you, and it's very inspiring for me. So
Thank
one
you.
last question, and then I'll let you enjoy your Sunday or Monday.
No,
So,
it's still Sunday. I'm not in a rush though, Jaime. You can
okay.
talk as long as you like.
Yeah. But this last one here, I'm curious if there is a work that inspired you to write when you were younger, and something that really inspired you recently. If you could share some works.
Gosh, you kept the tough one for last, didn't you? My
There's
goodness.
a lot. There's a lot, I'm
Okay.
sure.
Ah, okay. So I think definitely if we're talking about poetry, it might seem a bit incongruous, but Edward Lear was a Victorian, yes, the Owl and the Pussycat, of
Uh-huh.
course. So he actually wrote, obviously, the Owl and the Pussycat and longer poems like that. But he was also famous for his books of nonsense, which are
Oh.
exactly that. They're books of rhyming nonsense and limericks and all sorts. And I loved them. I can recite them to this day. And he was also an illustrator. In fact, he was an illustrator before he was a writer, and I love it. I think that's where I learned to love the rhythm of language and the melody of language and the fact that things don't need to make sense to be enjoyable as well, which is a key concept in poetry, isn't it, if we're honest. So definitely that. And yeah, I would definitely that. And then recently, my goodness, the amount of things I have read. I recently read J.P. Seabright's Abecedarian called Trauma. She's amazing. She's an experimental poet. And I mean, oh, she's just fantastic. And she's a good friend of mine as well. Nikki Dudley also has a really good collection that is being republished about dementia. Again, it's experimental. I loved, what was the one that I read? One book I really enjoyed was A Stovetop Ghosts by Katie Naylor. She's a very fantastic poet. Womb World, which was actually nominated for awards by Lisa B. Molina. Heart-wrenching. I have a nephew who has got a serious health condition. And it's even if you're not a parent, I mean, I defy you not to be sobbing like a child by the end of that book. I'm really enjoying lots of work from Guillemot Press. Their covers, I mean, even before you open the book, their covers are just a thing. You almost don't want to open it. It's like a cake that's so beautiful you don't eat it. They're so beautiful. They're all over my social media, so you can find them. La Mystérique is one of them. A beautiful book as well. And the Emma Press, who are a small northern press in the UK who do children's books and pamphlets. And they're run by, I think, a group of women, in fact, because they also publish a lot about motherhood, parenting, women's health issues, and all of their books are just a work of art from beginning to end. They just put such heart into it. And another one is the Ethelzine, who, I don't know if you've seen them on social media. Everything is hand sewn.
That's gorgeous.
I mean, what is that? I don't know
Yeah.
who has the time, but evidently they do. And it's so beautiful. And you hold it in your hands and it's a work of art, and you open it, every page. They clearly are also so discerning in their selections of what they publish, because every page is sumptuous poetry. Everything that I've had from them was amazing. So, I mean, those are some. I mean, there's so many, because I read a lot of other people's poetry. Sakshi Narula too. She has a new book called Bad Poetry out, which I love, and she did this incredibly boss thing where the cover is her face. It's amazing. That we should all do that. Like,
yeah.
But I love it. She's just going, you know what I mean? She comes out swinging. And it's her poems are sumptuous and rich and just overflowing, and it's like they're just amazing. It's like an overflowing cup of honey and nectar and wine. It's so good. It's so good. So yeah, no, I love them. If you want to know what I'm reading or what I recommend, follow me on social media. It's all there.
Perfect. And I think that's a wonderful note to end on, even though we've just scratched the surface. Elizabeth, this has been such a pleasure, and want to thank you for taking the time to do this on a Sunday, but also for your beautiful writing and your resilience and your intensity to embrace the calling, embrace your art, and really leading the way in that regard. It's been incredibly inspiring to me, and I do hope that we get to chat again sometime, because I want to learn about your pen names. I want to learn about Tropical Gothic a little bit more. There's just so much more. So I hope that we get to catch up down the road and pick up where we left off.
I hope so too, Jaime. This has been such a pleasure as well. Thank you so much for having me, and we'll stay connected on social media. Anyone else who's listening can find me. I'm at EMC Writes Poetry on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok, although I don't know what I'm doing on TikTok, so you don't have to follow me there. But thank you. This was so much fun.
Wonderful. Well, you have a lovely Sunday, and I'll be in touch on the internet, okay?
Okay, you too. Thanks, Jaime. Take care.
You too. Take care. Bye.
Bye.